All right, welcome everybody. My name is Angela Odur. Welcome to the second hangout we're having. We'd like to take you through a short demo of the new features of the new beta version of Ushahidi version 3, as well as take you through a code walkthrough so that you can understand what the infrastructural differences are between Ushahidi version 2 and Ushahidi version 3. I have some of my colleagues on the call with me today. I'll have them introduce themselves, and then we can hand over to the guys on the hangout as well.
Hi everybody, I'm Anargia. I'm a product manager working on V3.
Hi, I'm Linda. I'm working on the
Yeah. So we're really excited to have you guys joining us. I'm gonna have Woody and Brian just tell us a little bit about themselves, though you probably know them and have probably heard from them before, but worth repeating. Woody?
Hello everyone, I'm Woody Gilk. I've been with Ushahidi for a few months now, and I am the project manager on V3.
Thank you, Woody. Brian?
Hello, I'm Brian Herbert, been with Ushahidi about 5 years, and I'm the Director of Technology Operations. So I just kind of get my hands into everything. Used to be primarily on CrowdMap, but now doing all sorts of things. So nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice having you join us. Sharon, do you want to introduce yourself? Sharon. Okay, she's probably having connectivity issues, but Sharon is our quality assurance engineer. She's based in Nairobi with the rest of us. So feel free if you have any questions about testing, you can always pose those to her. So just a few housekeeping rules. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to post those on the Google Plus event page. We'll have a look at those and we'll probably fill those towards the last 15 minutes of the event. What we'd like to do is take about 10 minutes to go through the newest features of Ushahidi version 3, and then Woody will jump into giving us a little overview of the infrastructural changes for about 15 minutes before we open up the floor for questions. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Woody. You guys have a lot of interesting new stuff on beta 3, right?
I would say that we have some interesting new things. Not a ton of things have changed since beta 2, but we do have a few changes. The most notable new features are that the map configuration UI, which was an experimental feature before, is now complete and no longer has to be separately enabled. And message searching by sender name is now possible. And we've also we've updated the experimental form wizard, making some fixes there, so that particularly around the location input type, which presented a map, and that would previously break things when you tried to move those fields around. And I can give you a quick demonstration of them. Let me just start my screen sharing here.
Awesome.
And Angie, if you could switch my screen share to the primary feed here.
All done. You're the primary feed.
Okay. All right. So as we previously do, this is the Ushahidi developer dev site, and which means this is the demo site that is running the very latest code. Nothing significant has changed since last Thursday. We're working on several things that are in review right now, so this is pretty much exactly beta 3 right now. So as you can see now in the workspace menu, the map settings is now available all the time. If I go into site settings, in fact map settings is enabled, but we will see that yes, map settings is there. And so this is the map settings feature, has the default zoom level, combining clustering map reports, and changing the different map layers. So if I were to enable clustering, switch to, let's use Humanitarian OS OpenStreetMap and set the default zoom level there. And I will save those settings. Now if we return to the home page of the demo, you can see that it has been updated. And apparently OpenStreetMap doesn't want to load a couple of these tiles. But other than that, you can see that clustering is enabled, it's functional, zoom level's been set. So that is the major newest feature, and then I can also show you, if I can remember which form has the, yes, there we go, the map. So now if you move the map around, it doesn't cause the whole form thing to explode. I can't remember if I demoed this last time, but we have now changed this so that when you click on fields, it will actually show you. So it'll show you the editor on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side will be the preview of your form. So those, I would say, are the major changes since the last beta. Angie?
Awesome. So I actually have a question regarding the map configuration. So one of the things that I noticed that's kind of different from how it's done on version 2 is when you're setting the default location, users don't really have the option of inputting lat long information. Is that something that we're thinking about doing, or if not, what's the thinking behind that?
Helps if you unmute the microphone.
No worries.
I'm actually not able to answer that question. Robbie would be the person to answer that. He's primarily responsible for the mapping in V3. I believe it is actually possible to set a lat long for the default location, but I would have to confirm that with him.
Okay, no worries. That's okay. I guess that's something we can park for later, and then once we do get feedback, we'll pass it on to everybody else. So beyond that, I mean, this is all awesome stuff. What else can we expect in the next release? We're supposed to be doing one next week or the week after that. What are some of the big changes we expect to see in the next beta release?
Sure. In the next release, we are working on, there are a couple of things. One of them is we're working on visualizations. So actually being able to see report data as a format other than just as a map, but actually having some graphs over time. And I would expect that in the next release we'll at least have some demos of that available. I'm not sure if it will be built into the actual demo site, but they might be separate demos, but we will actually be able to show some of that off through the blog post or otherwise. We are going to implement differentiation between public and private posts. So you'll actually be able to take any report and mark it as either public or private with permission controls. We're going to do the same thing with tags. We will also be showing off some early preview of the graphical installer, which is being worked on fairly heavily right now and is going through the mock-up stage. And we have a very simple prototype working, and so we'll probably, again, I'm not sure that will be included in the actual release as a functional thing, but we'll be able to prototype or demo that on the blog. And other than that, I would say those are the major things that are happening. There are also some architectural things happening on the back end, but those will be not visible changes, just some house cleaning things.
Awesome, thanks. So I guess that kind of leads us to the main agenda of the day. You shared a really fantastic overview of the structural changes, using a clean code architecture and things like that, and the reasoning behind it. So I think it would be good if the rest of the community or everybody who's watching could also get to hear that from you right now, and maybe even have us go through those changes live within the code. So it's yeah. Let's just jump to that.
Sure. If you haven't already read it, there is a blog post that went out last week, and it's the first in a series of blog posts about the Ushahidi platform under the hood, getting into the actual architectural changes in the way that the code for the Ushahidi platform is written. So this is the blog post right here. I'm not going to go through and read it to you. You can read it on your own. But I do want to point out a couple of the diagrams here, and I want to mention a couple of important points. Our architecture is basically inspired by Uncle Bob, and he wrote this very, very fantastic blog post that kind of joined together a lot of stuff that he's been talking about and other people have been talking about for a number of years, and it's called The Clean Architecture. And I will just show you the quick diagram here. This is the clean architecture diagram, and we refer to it a lot. And basically, it represents many things, but the most important things that it represents is that you think of the architecture of the system in terms of layers, and things that are on the inner side do not depend upon things that are on the outer side. And what this, the most important things that the two things that this does is that it allows for highly testable code and a separation of concerns. Because the inner parts are not dependent upon the database or even a web server or anything like that, they can be completely tested in isolation without any sort of external dependencies at all. That is very important for being able to drive test-driven development, or as we do BDD, business-driven development, or sometimes also BDD is known as behavior-driven development. And it also allows the separation of concerns by having different parts of the application be very responsible for extremely specific and singular things. That kind of refers back to testable code, and it also allows us to define what the core business logic of the Ushahidi platform is without having to think about things like what does the HTML look like or how does the JavaScript work. We can just say the core of Ushahidi platform is responsible for taking this data and doing these specific things with it. So then beyond that, I would refer to the wiki for code organization if you want to explore this a little bit further. This document is fairly up to date. I've put some pretty serious work into it, and so to get it up to speed with where things are at today. And so this has a lot of specifics about, the different layers and how things work. It talks about the HTTP side of things, how the API interacts with the front end, etc. So please go take a look at that if you're at all interested in this and want to contribute to Ushahidi. I think this is a pretty good overview of all the different files and things and how they all play out together. And Angie, should I jump into the actual code now?
Yes, sure thing. Right. Yeah.
Let me just switch my screen share here. All right. And do I still have the feed, Angie?
Yes, you do. You're all set. Okay. Yeah.
So this is the bootstrap file for Ushahidi, and let me just open up the index page. All right. So the index page is the entry point for the web application, of course. And this is the index page. It's pretty basic. All it really does is define the document root here, and then it loads Kohana. We use the Kohana framework for the delivery part of the application. So I should So I guess I should talk about what I mean by the delivery part of the application. Um, the Ushahidi Platform v3 is split into two specific parts. There is the core application, which contains all of the business logic about how the platform interacts with the data. It's the modeling part. If you think about the platform in terms of model view controller, the MVC pattern, that's very common. The modeling part is basically all of our business applications. So that's not just a layer or a directory of models. It's actually an entire application in and of itself, and it defines how data comes into the system, how it gets validated, and then what those actual entities within the system look like. And then the delivery layer is the thing that handles all of the details, like what kind of database engine are you using? Are we using MySQL or Postgres? Right now, we only have support for MySQL, but the system is designed to be able to use pretty much any SQL database that with some minimum compatibility. Ultimately, we'll be targeting MySQL, Postgres, Microsoft SQL Server, and SQLite as as the various options available. That's not to exclude, say, NoSQL databases like MongoDB or anything like that. Those will also be possible. But at this point, we only have support for MySQL. So,
Woody?
yes, Angie.
Sorry, just sorry to interrupt you. Is it possible to bump up the font on the code display a little bit? I think some of our viewers are having a little trouble actually seeing the code content. Like just zooming in a little.
Yes.
Thank you.
There we go. Hopefully that will be a little bit better for people.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay. So now the delivery layer, we use the Kohana framework currently, but the delivery layer is responsible for doing the web side of things. So the delivery layer is basically the controller part of MVC, and then the view part for our system, because it's only an API, is simply rendering things to JSON or JSONP. Getting back into the code, here we're initializing the Kohana application by loading it as a single file. And I will show you that. So this is the Kohana application. This is the standard stuff that if you're familiar with the Kohana framework, often this would actually exist in the index file. But because we want to be able to use Kohana and just include it as a single file in multiple places in the system, we kind of separate that out into multiple levels. So this is your standard stuff, defining the application path, module path, all that kind of stuff. Going back to the index file, we do have this slight fork in the code. So if we're executing the system from the command line, it will run minion tasks. If not, it's a standard web request. So then from there, of course, we're going to use the application bootstrap, again, standard Kohana stuff, etc. Now, where we kind of depart and where we get into the business logic of things is that we have a second level in the system, which is a totally separate code base, uses namespaces, PSR2, code standards, etc. And that's the source directory, SRC. So this is actually the responsible part for, this is the bootstrap for the core application, what I was just talking about with the business entities. And the important thing is that this is completely dependency injected, it's modern style, and it really follows the clean code architecture in a much better way than the Kohana framework as a whole does, which is kind of a legacy system, does everything all in one place. It's dependency injected. We use Aura DI as our dependency injection container, and we do it all with this service function. Now the service function, you can see an example of it right here. The service function is a service locator, which allows us to define services both in the business logic and in the delivery layer in order to implement the larger requirements for the system. So the service locator, because everything is defined through that, and we only refer to it by these keys like repository config, rather than the actual any specific file name, the service locator allows each one of those services to be replaced with an equivalent service, so long as it implements the same basic requirements. You can swap out those pieces however you want. So anytime that you want to access a service, you call the service function and define what you're looking for, and it will get it out of the Aura DI container. So because this is the business logic, it only contains some very specific things. It contains the use cases. And it also contains the entities, but we don't interact with the entities as services because entities are just objects. And the services, the use case services, are the useful part of the core business. So as you can see, this is defining the use cases for the services, but it's also using things that are not defined in this system, right? So it has validators and repositories, as well as some tools. And these things are not defined here, so they must be defined somewhere else. And where they're defined is going to application. So now these services are defined in the delivery layer. So the business layer defines the interfaces for storage and things like that, and it also defines the use cases. And the use cases are core, but the storage part is just a detail. That goes back to, we want to be able to replace the database with other kinds of databases. So that all happens in the delivery layer, and this is where the delivery layer services are defined. So here we talked about those repositories. Well, all the repositories are defined in the delivery layer because that's where the database interactions take place. Again, the core can be tested without a database. The delivery implements the actual storage of stuff. So most of the services actually live in the delivery layer, but they can move around however they need to. And now I'll take you through a basic from end to end. Let's use a tag. So the very, very inner part, if we go back to the clean code diagram, the very, very inner part is entities. So in Ushahidi platform, this is the entity for a tag. I'm just using this as an example because tags are pretty simple to understand. So we say that a tag is an entity, consists of an ID, parent ID, tag slug, type, etc., all of those things. And we also say that the tag has a repository. So the tag repository that is at the entity level just defines some very basic things on read-only access for the storage of the repository storage. We can get a tag by a single ID, or we can search for a tag given some parameters and search data. Well, what is this tag search data? Search data is what we call a data transfer object. And again, this is defined at the entity level, and it says that these are the search parameters for a tag. So then if we have a use case for a tag, we want to be able to create it, and everything in the system is specified. So I'm going to show you a quick specification for this, and this is how we test all of the use cases. And then I'll show you the actual use case. So this is tag creating. This is the test. It uses a testing system called PHP spec. Somebody is not muted. Declan, did you just join?
I muted him. It's okay. You can go ahead.
Okay. Just hearing a little bit of feedback there. Okay.
Sorry.
Getting back to it. Yes, so we use PHP spec, and this is what creating a tag looks like. This is the use case, the class, and then we have a test that says it has to fail with invalid input, and then we say if it's given valid input, it will actually create the tag. So this is our basic input for creating a tag. Given this input, it'll pass and create the tag. So now I'll show you the actual use case. So here we are, and this is the actual use case. So the use case, as everything in the core application will, defines its dependencies, because everything is dependency injected. So here we're saying that in order to create this use case, we need to have a creating tag repository and a validator. Once those dependencies are met, we can interact with the use case. We can give it some tag data as input. When it validates, if it doesn't validate, we'll throw an exception. We provide some basic reformatting of the color. We just want to make sure that it doesn't have the hash mark at the beginning when we store it. And then we use the repository to create the tag. Once the tag has been created, we return that entity. And that is the complete use case. So then how would you actually go about using the use case? Well, first you would have to implement the create tag repository, because again, in the core business, there is no explicit database storage defined. So let's just look at that quickly. So this is the interface for creating a tag. And we're just defining the basic requirements for creating a tag. We have to have tag, slug, description, type, and then optionally, it can have a color and an icon. We can get back the created tag ID after it has been created and the created timestamp, and then we can also get back the actual entity. Now you remember that we used a data object as input. So what does that look like? Well, it's just a very, very simple object. It just defines the input as public properties. Now, the data object, as you can see, it's not just a plain PHP object. It does actually extend from something called data. Data is just a very, very simple wrapper around this that takes an array of input, for instance, like the request variable in PHP, and then parses and takes that input as raw data and then fills out these public fields. So let's actually see what this looks like. So in the delivery layer, the application delivery, we have the controller for API tags. And this is, if we post to this controller, it will create a tag. So here we're using the service locator to get the use case. We also use a parser to create that the tag data. And at the end, we'll use a formatting service to represent that tag and reformat it for delivery. So we take the parser, we take the request payload, which is going to be coming into the system because this is a REST API. It's going to come in as JSON. At this point, it's been parsed by the Ushahidi delivery request part. It's been turned into a plain array. We put it into the parser, and we get this input back. This should actually be called input for clarity. And then once we have that input, we send it into the use case. If the validation fails, we're going to respond with a HTTP error. And then at the end of it, we're going to format that tag and send it back as the response payload. To every response payload, we also append this allowed methods. And the allowed methods just tells the end user, the consumer of that API call, what other methods it's possible to use on this particular entity. So let's talk about the parser for a minute. This is something that exists in the delivery layer because we have to take raw input. So this is the parser. A parser is just a basic thing. It's invoked using PHP 5.4 magic method, which allows you to use an object as a function. So it takes that array of input data and does some very, very basic pre-formatting and validation of that input. We know that at minimum, the tag has to have a tag name, a slug, and a type. So we're just going to verify that those are not empty. We don't actually do any sort of validation as to the content of them. We just say that they have to be defined. And if they fail, if they're not defined, then we're going to throw a parser exception, which is an extension of a validation exception. So it would be caught by the same try-catch block that you saw in the controller. And then once everything is good, we create this new tag data object with all of the input that was given. And that's really it from end to end. And if we were to refer back to platform or the blog post about the platform architecture, what I just showed you is represented by this diagram right here. And I think that's basically it. Obviously, there are other use cases, for updating tags, deleting tags, things like that, or any other entity in the system. But for the most part, this is that's how it works, and it works the same for those other use cases as well. Andy?
Awesome. Thanks for that, Woody. That was pretty insightful. I think I'm still absorbing most of that, as are probably the rest of our viewers. So I'm wondering if anyone on the Hangout right now actually has any questions. And for those of you who are watching now, would actually be a really good time as well. Take advantage of the fact that you have Woody here right now. If you have any questions regarding how everything is structured, if there's anything at all you didn't understand about use cases and direct access and all that stuff, now would actually be the time. So I don't know, Brian, Sharon, do you guys have any questions yet? I'm guessing not. Anagya, do you have anything for Woody?
No.
Okay. Linda? All right. So doesn't look like we have any questions from the audience, which is rather surprising, but I'm guessing you can take as much time as you need to kind of absorb all of that. If you have any questions, you know where to reach us. We're on IRC via email. One thing I do want to let you guys know about is the fact that Woody is actually going to be at OSCON next week. He's going to be giving an Ignite talk about, maybe I should let Woody say what he's going to be talking about instead of talking to him. Woody?
Find the mute button. Find the mute button. Yes.
Okay.
My Ignite talk at OSCon is going to be about the technology behind massive social movements. I'm going to talk about what the key requirements are for a good platform, a good tool that will allow social movements to happen. Of course, we think that Ushahidi platform is one of those tools, but really it's going to be much more general. It's not a pitch for the Ushahidi platform. It's just an exploration of what makes a successful tool in this space.
Awesome. So looks like we actually have a couple of questions streaming in. So we have one from Daniel who wants to know what is your best practice to debug the PHP backend? So just explaining a little bit about that, how we handle testing on V3.
Sure. Well, PHP, of course, is a runtime language, so you will actually get exceptions back from the system if any particular thing goes wrong. We do, of course, because everything is going through the API, I would say there are two primary tools for that. The first being our test suite. So if you are actively doing the BDD with PHP spec, you will be able to test everything as it happens, and that will help you in debugging. And then the other thing is that we have the API Explorer, which will be getting fleshed out in the very near future. And I will just again, this is for people who haven't seen it. This is the API Explorer. And so using this, you can actually test various things as it happens. And beyond that, debugging, I would say that those are the two primary tools. And if you're doing everything test-driven first, that's the most important thing. And then if you do have exceptions, you'll see those come back directly in the output of API calls. And they do get reformatted by the API itself in a way that's fairly readable. I also see that there's a question from Brian here about the migration path from V2 to V3. We do have a built-in tool, which is hopefully, I would say, we'll be talking about that, if not in the next release, the release following that, which would be, let's see, next one will be beta 4, so it would be a beta 4 or beta 5. And that upgrade tool does allow you to take a V2 database and fully import it into V3. David, one of our co-founders and one of the kind of managers for V3, has been testing this tool pretty heavily with some of his existing V2 databases, and it seems to be doing quite well. So there are a couple of little things that we need to iron out, but other than that, once that system is finished and fully tested, you will be able to take any V2 database and run it through that tool, and it will generate a V3 database for you, which you can then use.
Awesome. Brian wants to know if there's also a quick reference for the possible services. Yeah, seen that?
I do. The quick reference, I would say you would have to, if you look at the DI container, let me just pop over to GitHub for simplicity here. So if you look at the two sources that we define services, one being in source init and the other one being in application classes Ushahidi core, these are the only two places that services are defined anywhere. So I realize this is maybe not ideal coming from an IDE perspective, but this will show you, anywhere that you see a DI set call, that's going to tell you exactly what the expected type is coming back, and so then you can go and you can see exactly where things are defined, and then like what the expected class that will be coming back from that is. And if you have any suggestions on some way that we can type hint this better to work better with IDE type hinting and return hinting, I'd love to hear it. I don't obviously in the demo, I was using Vim. I'm not a heavy IDE user, but I do understand that that is a pretty major feature for people that use it. So if you have suggestions on ways that we can improve that, by all means, let me know.
Cool. So Brian has another question on whether we have an example of a test that swaps out a service for a Mach 1 to remove the dependency.
Well, all of our tests that for mocking at this point are not done that way. Our spec tests are dependency free. They don't actually use the service locators at all. We only use the service locators in the actual concrete code and not in the test code. So at this point, we don't really have a particular need for that. And again, if you have suggestions on some way that we could do that better, or an example of where that might be required, please, by all means, let me know. And I also see a question from Daniel here.
Daniel, yeah.
About the technical details of the sets features and the planned alert feature. The sets feature is only basically stubbed out. There aren't any, as it's currently implemented, it has almost no implementation, really. And so Sarah will be working on that in the very, very near future. And I think we'll be reaching out to you as well, Daniel, because I know that you're keenly interested on sets and alerts. And so she is going to be working on that in the next couple of weeks here. And so I would expect that you'll hear from her shortly about the sets feature, and we'll discuss the details of that with you.
Okay, awesome. So I'll just take us back to the discussion about being able to migrate a version 2 deployment onto V3. So just to recap, how soon are we saying that we'll probably have something for deployers to play around with? Because one of the other things is all of our beta releases have really been geared towards developers. So I guess the question really is, how soon would they be able to kind of grab something and see this apply to their own deployment? And that the first step would probably be testing out the migration script. Like, how soon are we ready to open that up to them to have a look at and play around with?
Well, as I said earlier, David has been testing the migration script internally. The biggest caveat right now with the migration script is that it doesn't work very well with customized deployments. So if you've made heavy modifications to the database or to the V2 code, then it probably won't work very well for you. But for any sort of vanilla or like CrowdMap Classic type deployments, it should work very well. And we will be more explicitly talking about that tool and documenting it via blog posts and stuff in either the next release, Beta 4, or the release following that, Beta 5. So maximum of 1 month away.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification, Woody. And thanks to everyone for the questions. We have about 1 more minute before we have to end. But I'd like to say thanks for your patience and thank you for joining us. We hope that this session was useful for you. Just stay tuned to all our different streams, IRC, Twitter, Facebook, the blog. We're having the next release within another week, and then that means that we'll have another meetup after that. So if you have any suggestions on any topic that you want to discuss, feel free to reach out to myself or any member of the team. You can reach out to us via Twitter, Facebook, or via info@ushahidi.com, and we'll be happy to reach out to you. And if you're attending OSCON, make sure you hang out with Woody and the rest of the team. There's going to be a OSCON Ushahidi happy hour on the 23rd of July at 6:30 PST at the B-Side Tavern. So you want to go for that. Otherwise, without further ado, I'll close this off. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Have a fantastic evening. For those of you who missed it, we'll have a recording available for you after this. Bye, guys.